What's going on, everybody? Today I'm going to go over how to set up a Unifi access point for the first time. Now this is a video I've actually done before, but it was a few years ago. There's been a few changes to the controller, and there's a few other things that I kind of want to go through that I didn't really hit on in the last video. So let's go ahead and get started. Right here I've got a brand new Unifi UAP-AC-PRO. Now these are technically older. They have the Unifi 6 and like the Unifi 6 LR, but the setup and everything is all still the same. So let's just go ahead and unbox it. And we can go ahead and get rid of the box. So what we have in the box is the access point itself here, a metal mounting bracket. This is actually for what do you call it, drop ceilings, just to put basically on the other side of your ceiling panels. You put this on that side, your bolts go through, your access point hangs on the bottom. Typically I never use that even on drop ceilings. I usually just screw the access point directly to the ceiling panel, but that's technically not the right way to do it. We've also got this PoE Injector. Every Unifi access point comes with one of these unless you order a 5-pack. That is an important difference. If you're ordering them one by one, you will get the injector, but if you order a pack of 5 from Ubiquity, you will not get the PoE Injector, and you'll have to find that either separately or just make sure that you have your own switch capable of power over Ethernet. Now the other stuff we got is just the power cord for the power injector and our hardware to mount it either to a wall or to a ceiling panel or whatever. So we've got our drywall anchors. These are our long bolts, and that's usually used with this plate, and our regular screws, which is usually what I just use. Now on the bottom of the access point itself, there is this mounting plate, and it's already on there when you get it out of the box. To get it off, there's a little clip right here. It also lines up with this tab on the side. That is how you would get it disconnected from the ceiling or the wall once you've actually mounted it. And that is the part that can be a little bit annoying to get off. Straight out of the box, when you're just looking at the top, you can lift up this tab as long as it goes over this notch here. It spins and it comes off. Now when you are attaching this to the ceiling or just putting this back on in general, usually you would have this part screwed either to the wall or the ceiling, but there is an arrow here, and that lines up with this little notch on the edge of the access point. You can kind of barely see it. As long as the arrow goes to right there, then you can twist it and it'll lock. Now if it's already on the ceiling, this is kind of the annoying part. You usually take a paper clip or something. I've just got a pair of tweezers, stick it in this little side hole. I don't know if I can get it in there. And you can see it lifts up the tab over that little notch, and it is pretty annoying, but once that tab clears the notch, you can spin it freely. I guess these tweezers aren't going to work. That's the annoying part. Even though you know where the disconnect area is and you have a tool to try and do that, you still have to make sure the tab clears the notch, and sometimes that can get a little frustrating. Alright, now just grab me a paper clip. Let's see if we have more luck with this. Stick it in there, notch clears, and you can spin it. So that's pretty much all you need to know about what comes in the box. The access point itself, depending on the model you bought, will have 1 or 2 Ethernet ports. And this area right here, this is just a rubber grommet that is to protect it from weather. I don't think these are specifically outdoor rated, but you can put them somewhere that may not be ideal for these to go. So this is just to protect the Ethernet ports. And there's also this tab here. This is what allows the cable to kind of come in while it's flush either on the wall or on the ceiling. And you really just kind of dig this grommet out and you have access to the Ethernet ports. So since this one is the UAC-AP-PRO, we have a main connection and a secondary connection. So your primary cable from your switch or power injector or whatever is going to go into the main, and then you can daisy chain other devices off of this secondary port. However, you cannot pass through PoE through it. I think I made the mistake of saying that you could in my video I did a few years ago. You cannot. So as long as you have a switch or something else on the other end here that doesn't require PoE to be passed through, you can use it. Now you might also see there's a USB port. I'm not entirely sure what that's used for. Just because I've never used it, I don't know if you can access a console or Maybe you can put some firmware files on it. I have no idea. I haven't looked up what it does, and I've never had the need to. Now the last part I'm going to mention is the reset button. That's just your typical little reset hole. Again, use a paper clip, hold that down while it's powered on. This LED on the front will start flashing, and that's how you reset it to factory. Now there's only really a couple reasons you would want to do that. One is for some reason it's not behaving how you think it should. You're having trouble getting it adopted, or you want to reset it to be able to adopt it to another controller, which we'll get into here in just a minute. So let's go ahead and just kind of clear this extra hardware out of the way and get a couple Ethernet cables. So if you're going to be using the power injector, obviously you're going to want to plug that in, so just attach the cable, plug that into the wall, and look at your two ports. So you can see we've got one that's red, it says PoE, and one that is not, it says LAN. So this port is going to go to your switch or whatever network device you're connecting this AP to, and this port is going to go to your access point. This one provides power, this one doesn't. So let's go ahead and connect it up like we're going to use it, PoE into that port, and we're going to run this cable to our main connection of our access point. Then we're going to connect our LAN port of our PoE injector, and this other end is just going to go to our switch or whatever network equipment we have. I'm just going to connect it to my desktop switch here. And for the sake of completion, I went ahead and plugged in the PoE injector to my power bar behind this box here. And you can see we've got the power light. Actually, I'm going to shut these lights off. And you can see we have the power light on our injector, so our injector is on. And we should be getting a light on our access point now since we plugged it into the PoE port. And there we go, we have a solid white light. Now this LED on the access point can mean a variety of different things depending on its color and what it's doing. So right now it's solid white, which we just plugged it in, so really that just means it has power. Solid white really means that it is on and it's ready for adoption. However, right now it hasn't booted up yet, so there it changed from solid white to flashing white. If it's flashing white, that means the device is booting up. So once it's finished booting, since this is a brand new access point, it should go back to solid white, which means that it's ready to be adopted by the controller software. And this only takes a few seconds. There we go, it's already solid white again. So now your access point is ready to be found, adopted, and configured. Now there's another color that this could be, and that's blue. On these newer, especially the Pro ones, you only have white and blue to work with. Some of the older access points also had amber, but you pretty much consult your device documentation for what those different LED statuses mean. On this one, solid white, it's on, it's ready to be adopted. Flashing white, it's booting up. Blue means that it's already adopted and there's no problems if it's solid. If it's flashing between white and blue, that means that you've pushed a firmware upgrade to it and it is updating the firmware. There's some other stuff that it can do, like basically strobing white. That pretty much just means there was a problem, it crashed, you need to power cycle it. If it's going between blue, white, and off, then it's in TFTP mode. There's quite a few different statuses, but really, if you don't know what it's trying to tell you, look at the device manual and see what that specific color and flashing combination means. Now I'm going to go ahead and just turn this light back on for a second. If you have a switch capable of PoE, you do not need to use this power injector. You can go ahead and unplug it. Instead of using the injector, just plug the AP directly into the switch and bypass this injector. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll plug that into the main. The other end of this cable is just going to my desktop switch. Turn that light back off, and since my switch is PoE capable, we get the white light and it's going to go through that boot up process that we just saw. Now at this point, we can move from actually looking at the AP itself to how to configure it. And to take a look at that, we're going to move to the PC and start setting up what's called the controller. Okay, so now that our AP is powered up and ready to be adopted, we can go ahead and install what is called the controller software. Now, these access points are a little bit different from some that you might be used to. These are technically what's called like an SDN device, software-defined networking. So what that means is that the management is not on the access point itself. You don't just log into the web page of the access point, set it up, and then do that for every access point that you get. You have to download what is called the Unifi controller application, and that is where all the configuration is done. You adopt these access points into the software and then do your configurations. So there are two ways to do this. One, which is the recommended and really the only way you should do it, is to download and install the controller to either a desktop PC or a server or some kind of actual computer on your network, where you can host that application and configure all your devices. The second option is the mobile app, which is cool that it is an option. You can actually set up the access points independently using the mobile app if you just want to quickly set up an access point on your home network and you don't really want to get into, or you don't care about all of the controller capabilities. However, you do still have to have the app, which is kind of like a controller light, if you will. So to do this on an iPhone, we're going to go ahead and go to Search and Unifi. And the application we want is just Unifi Network. I've already downloaded this before, so I'm just going to click download. It is free, but once it's downloaded, we're just going to open that. We're going to allow it to use Bluetooth because these newer access points can actually be set up using Bluetooth, and you would like to allow it to connect to devices on your local network, so we're going to hit OK. And here we can already see that we have our access point UAP-AC-PRO under independent devices, and it says that it is ready for setup. So here is where we kind of hit a little bit of a problem depending on how your network's already set up. So for me right now, I already have Wi-Fi and I'm already connected to my Wi-Fi, which is the same network that I've put this new AP on. So when I open this application, it automatically found that AP because it is on the same network. Now, if you're setting this up and you don't already have Wi-Fi, this isn't going to show up for you. You're going to have to do a different method, either the full-blown controller, which I'm going to show right after this, or you can set it up with Bluetooth. And how you do that is you tap Set Up a New Device. It's going to search for consoles, which we don't have one installed. Well, we wouldn't have one installed because we wouldn't be on Wi-Fi to begin with. But what this should show, and actually what I'm going to do, I'm going to unplug that AP so I can show it correctly. Okay, so I've unplugged that access point. It is no longer showing up in this list of devices ready to be configured. So I'm going to click on Set Up a New Device again. It's going to search for new consoles. Now it shouldn't find any. So what we're going to do is tap Other Setup Options after it's failed to find a console, and we're going to click on Standalone Unifi Access Point. And here it gives us a list of directions to power it on, connect it to a router, which we had already done. We'd already connected it to a switch, our network that's already set up, and it says to scan the QR code on the back of the AP. So let's go ahead and tap Ready to Scan, and it would like to access our camera, so we're going to hit OK. And now we can actually scan the QR code that's on the back of our access point. So if we flip that around, there's a QR code right there. It's got it. Now it wasn't powered up, so I'm going to go ahead and plug it back in. Wait for it to boot up and get ready again, and now it is. So I'm going to click on Connect, and it says Unifi Network wants to join Wi-Fi network, blah, 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 blah. Go ahead and join. And what that is just this access point's internal setup only wireless network. So we're connecting to AP, and now that we're actually connected on the phone, I've lost connection to show you because I'm no longer on my wireless network, which was streaming my phone screen. So let's go ahead and switch to this janky camera here, and you can see we have the option to continue without console. Basically, we're setting this access point up without a controller. We can give it a name, so we're just going to call it Toasties AP, and then click Next, and then it asks us for our wireless setup. So this is going to be our actual SSID, or the name of the wireless network you see when you're trying to connect to it. We're just going to call it Toasties Network, give it a password of like PASSWORD1234, and we can set advanced options if we'd like. Well, really the only advanced option is separate 2.4 and 5 gigahertz networks. If we enable this option, you're going to have two SSIDs. So one of them is going to be like Toasties Network 5G and Toasties Network 2G. Typically, I don't do this unless I have a very good reason to. I'm going to go ahead and keep that disabled so it only shows one wireless network name, and depending on the device and how far you are from it, it'll either connect to 2.4 or 5 gigahertz automatically. So go ahead and get out of that keyboard, hit next again, and then you have the option to set a recovery password for independent devices. You can go ahead and view that. It automatically creates this long, complicated one, so I'm just not going to change that, but make note of that if you think you will need it in the future to recover the device. Go ahead and click next. It's adding the access point, and at the bottom here it says that setup will take about 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So we're just going to wait for that to do its thing. Okay, and at this point it says it's finishing up and that it's preparing our access point AC-PRO. Says there's about 10 seconds left. And there we go. Now it says connect to your access point AC-PRO. Now, join Wi-Fi network. Would you like to join the Wi-Fi network? Toasties network. Yep, that's the one we just set up. So we'll go ahead and join. And it should automatically put in our password we created for it since we're in the app. And it does. It says we're now successfully connected to Toasties network. And we get this warning. We have limited AP functionality. Now the only reason we get this is because we set it up independently. We didn't use a controller, and this is just telling us that the AP can't be managed remotely or associated with our UI account. It's recommended to use a Unifi OS console and then adopt it to get the full experience. So yes, we don't get all the functionality of a controller because we didn't use one. And now since we're connected again, I can switch back to my wireless display. So here we go. Obviously the AP is working, or else I wouldn't have been able to connect to my phone, but this is what the screen looks like after you've set it up. So if we click on our device, Toasties AP, under our independent devices, here we have our various details, IP address, MAC address, device version, etc., etc. We can actually see connected clients, and that's my phone that I'm connected to it with. That's the only client we have. But the only actions we have, at least in this menu, are to locate, restart, or see the RF environment. Locate, all that's going to do is flash the LED on the front to blue. That's really just used if you have a lot of these access points and you're trying to relay that to some technician who might be working on it. Say like, hey, we need the one in this hall of this hotel worked on. I'm going to locate it, look for the one that's flashing. In a home environment, there's probably going to be no need for you to do that at all, unless you're just really confused at which AP you're looking at and making sure it's the right one. Restart, that's self-explanatory. RF environment, you can do a scan just to see how crowded your channels are. In a home environment, that's usually not necessary. It will disable the access point if you want to do that, so we're not. It also takes like 5 to 10 minutes to actually do the scan and report back, but for our purposes, there's really no reason to run that. Do it if you want. We're going to go ahead and go into the menu of configure and see what we can do here. So the options we have without the actual controller here on the app itself, we can go into radios, we can turn on or off our 5 or 2.4 radio, we can change our bandwidth between 20 and 40 for 2.4 or 20, 40, and 80 on our 5. We can change the transmit power between auto, high, medium, low, or custom. And we can also change the channel that the AP is set to. Now, these configurations are really, I'm going to say, more advanced. This is if you really want to optimize and tune your network. I did a video on how to optimize a unified network if you want to check that out. A lot of these settings have to do with that. So I would just leave them default, which is auto and the bandwidth that they're already set to, as well as transmit power auto. That's usually the best for most applications unless you really need to tune it. Now the next thing we can change is WLANs. This is just our SSID that we set up. If you need to change your password, you can do it here. You can also view the password that you set for both the 2.4 and 5, even though they are technically merged into one. Not really sure why there's two different settings there when we had the option to merge it. And then device credentials. This is just your admin password to actually manage the device itself using something like SSH or adopting it to a new controller. For this video, we won't be doing anything with this information. This is a more advanced piece of information for you. I will be doing another video on how to do what's called layer 3 adoption, and at that point we will be using this information, but just ignore that for now. The rest of this just shows us the firmware version, and we actually do have the ability to upgrade our firmware here. If we just click upgrade, then we can upgrade from a pretty old version of 4 up to the latest, which is 6.0.21. And the last option we have is reset, and what that does is resets the AP to factory defaults, which would start it over to basically the beginning of this video. And that's pretty much all you need to know on how to set it up. At this point, it's set up, it's good to go. I'm connected to it. I have an internet connection, obviously, since I'm using this wireless display over it. If we really want to verify that we are connected, let's go ahead and run a speed test. And the full speed of my internet's actually 500 up, 500 down, so we're getting 250, and it looks like over 300. So getting about half the throughput download and a little over half up. But that just verifies that we have connectivity. Now let's go ahead and move on to setting up the actual controller software on a computer. So for this, I'm going to move over to this designated test PC that I'm going to be using for this controller setup. And before I start, just a couple of notes on the actual controller itself. A question that I get asked a lot is, when I install the controller, do I have to have it running all the time for my access points to work? And the answer is no. Just like with that mobile app that we just did, the mobile app connected to the access point, we configured our networks, and that's really it. Obviously, your phone is not going to be on your network all the time while you're out and about. So that would be a little silly if your phone had to always be connected as the controller to your access point for it to work. Basically, the controller just manages the devices. Once you configure your settings in the controller, it pushes them to your access points, and then your access points hold on to that information. So once we install this controller, we can shut the computer we install it on off. We can honestly just forget about it entirely if we want to, or uninstall it from that computer. You might not want to do that because all of your configurations are saved there, and once we adopt a device, it is tied to that instance of a controller. So while the controller doesn't have to be on all the time for your devices to work, you do need that same instance of the controller to do any configuration changes down the line. And there are options to back up and restore controllers to different computers, migrate access points between controllers, but that's outside of the scope of this setup video. Just the main thing I want you to know is that you don't have to have the controller running all the time, but your access point is tied to that instance of the controller, so another controller will not be able to manage your access point once you have set it up. Again, unless you do other steps that I'm not going to show in this video. Now, a caveat to what I just said is if you're using a guest portal, which is also outside the scope of this video, or radius, those two do need a controller to be on all the time in order for those two features to work. But as far as I'm aware, those are the only two features that will require a controller to be on all the time. Also, since your controller is collecting data on client history, bandwidth throughput, and all of that, you are obviously not going to get those historical statistics if your controller isn't running. So again, while it's not required, there are two features, and obviously the historical statistics that you will not get if it's not on all the time. So let's go ahead and open up Chrome, and I'm just going to Google Unifi controller, and our first result is going to be Unifi Ubiquity downloads. We'll go ahead and go there. And this is Unifi's main software download page, and you have a ton of options here. Basically, all of these are firmware for the different devices. This first section is all firmware, but if we scroll down to the software section, we have Unifi Network Application and whatever the latest version is for Windows, Debian, Ubuntu, or Mac OS. Since we're on Windows, we're going to download that version and accept the agreement. And from here, we're just going to click Download File. That gets us our Unifi installer.exe. We can show that in the Finder or folder. I'm on Windows, not a Mac. And we just need to double click our Unifi installer to start the installation. Click Install. At this point, if you don't have Java installed, it'll pop up a thing that says, hey, you need Java to run the controller. And then you click Install. It'll automatically pop up a Java download page. Just download Java, install it, and then rerun this installer. I wasn't really aware that I already had Java on this computer, but apparently I do because I did not get that warning. So at this point, let's hit Finish, and we have Start Unifi Controller checked, so it's automatically going to start it up. And I'm just going to exit these windows because we don't need them anymore. And here we go, we've got Unifi Network Application right here. Pretty much as long as this box is up, visible either down here or somewhere on the screen, then your controller is running. And it gives you the status of it. So right now it's starting the network application. If there are any errors with startup, it'll have a little red exclamation point, and it'll tell you kind of what the issue is, or at least that there is a problem with it starting. At that point, then there's further troubleshooting you'll have to do, which I'm not going to go into in this video, but if you do hit something like that, leave it in the comments below. The most common reason for that is if you're installing this network application on a computer or a server that already has an application on port 8443 or 8080. Those are the two main ports that this controller uses. There are others, but those are the main ones that it needs to have open on the computer to work. And if either of those are taken up by another application on the computer, if you're serving different ones that just happen to be using that port, then the controller will not start successfully. So ours did start successfully. We're going to go ahead and click launch a browser to manage the network, and that's going to automatically throw up our default internet browser and take us to our controller web page. Now we are going to get a certificate error. Let's just go past that, continue to localhost, and enter the basic setup. So here we can name our controller, and this is just the name of our controller instance itself. So I'm just going to call it Toasties Controller, and we need to check this box to agree to the end user license agreement. Now we do have the option to restore setup from a backup, so this is one of those where if we were moving or just needing to restore our controller, we can upload a backup file, which is downloaded once this is set up, and we can restore the state of that controller. But for now, let's go ahead and click next, and now it says sign in with your Ubiquiti account. Now this step's actually optional, so if you have a UI account, you can enter it here. It'll sign in to Unifi's website, and that gives you what's called the remote access to your controller. So on Unifi's website, if you go to the Unifi console area, actually I guess I can go ahead and just pop that up, ui.com. Here in the top right you have the Unifi portal, and this is where you can sign into your Unifi account and have remote access to your controllers. So to enable that type of access, you will want to put in your UI username and password here. I'm not personally a fan of that. I never use the remote access anyway, so I actually don't have, well, I say I don't have a UI account. I do, but I honestly don't remember the password to it because I never use it unless I'm buying equipment. So what we can do if we don't want to use a UI account is switch to advanced setup and disable both of these, and that is enable remote access and use your Ubiquiti account for local access. Once we disable those, we get these boxes, which is a local administrator, username, password, setup. This is what I always use for my controllers just because I never use the remote access option, and I like having them locally configured anyway. So I'm going to set the username to admin, and we'll just do password 1234 for the controller password. And I believe you have to have an administrator email. Yeah, I can't click next without one. Well, you can see it'll automatically fill out the one I usually use, which is 123@123.com, because it thinks that's not an actual email address. You can put in your real one if you want to. I don't even worry about it. I just put in a fake one every time. So let's go ahead and click next. Enable auto backup is checked. That is a good feature to have. I pretty much never disable that. Well, I say pretty much. I never disable that. It's always on. That just makes sure that the controller is constantly backing up. I think it's either every day or every week, so that you have an automatic backup if you need to restore it. So go ahead and click next, and then we have our devices set up. If we hadn't have already set up our access point with the mobile app, it would show up here as ready for adoption. So if you have any devices fresh out of the box, ready for adoption, they should show up at this point, and you can automatically adopt them here in the setup instead of going through it later in the actual controller, which is what we're going to do. We're just going to skip this step and move on to the Wi-Fi setup. So here you can pre-configure a wireless network, basically just like we did with the mobile application. We can call it Toasties New Wi-Fi. Just going to give it a password of password 1234 again. And here I'm going to check combine 2 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz networks into one name. So again, all this does is just makes it where there's one SSID instead of like Toasties New Wi-Fi 2G or Toasties New Wi-Fi 5G. So now let's go ahead and click next. And this is just a review of all the configurations that we did. So our network application is going to be called Toasties Controller. Local administrator username is admin. Our Wi-Fi name that we're setting up is Toasties New Wi-Fi. And then we have our country and time zone information, which both of those are correct. If they're not for you, then just change them and click finish. And now we are met with the dashboard of our controller, which in this newer version is a lot of advertisements for other Unifi equipment. But if we had actual devices, we could have a graph or some sort of statistic here. And you can actually exit at least that one. And you can see it says Wi-Fi experience score not yet available. That's because we haven't adopted any equipment. To adopt our access point in the controller, we're going to go to the device tab on the left, so Unifi devices, and it says no Unifi devices have been adopted, which is correct. And the only reason our access point we just plugged in doesn't show up here is because we already configured it as an independent device. So I'm just going to go back into my network application and hit reset to reset this access point to factory default so that we can pretend that we didn't even set it up with the app and it's fresh out of the box. And while it's doing that, I'm just going to go back into the controller. Basically, I'm just waiting for the access point to stop flashing the white LED and go solid. Alright, so since I reset that access point, it now shows up in the Devices tab. And all we've got to do is just click to adopt. And that pops up the right side panel, and we adopt the device. And we also get this pop-up, which was actually new. Well, it said add this device to a UBNT device group. Really, you don't need to do that. But now it is adopting the AP to this controller, and it is automatically upgrading the firmware to the latest it has. So while in the mobile app it didn't have us do any of that, but it was an option in the menu, with these new versions of the controller, it automatically updates it to the latest firmware as it adopts it. And we can also see something interesting here. It says the IP address is 192.168.1.20. That is the default IP address of these, or in other words, the fallback IP. So if the device doesn't grab an address from DHCP or anything like that, it'll default to 192.168.1.20. Now, I don't think that that's actually accurate because it showed up here, and my network is not 192.168.1.anything, so I think that's just misreporting the IP, which is kind of a theme in different places of the controller where some of the information can be misreported for whatever reason. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh the page, and yeah, there we go. Our address is an actual address that is on my network, 10.88.13.186. So while we're just waiting for the firmware to upgrade and the device to be adopted, basically what's going to happen is once it is adopted to the controller, it's going to enter the provisioning state, which is going to push any of the wireless networks to that access point. So the wireless network we set up during controller setup, which was Toasty's new Wi-Fi, that's going to automatically be pushed to the device, and it's going to automatically start broadcasting it. And that would be true for any and all access points we add to this controller, unless we do what that little pop-up said and split them into groups, which we're not going to worry about. But just be aware, if you do have multiple access points, say you have 3 of these, you connect them all, you go through this adoption process in the controller, they're all going to get that wireless network that we configured at the beginning. And so now we've moved to the online state. If we click on our device, that's going to pop all of these details out to the right side. You can see our device version did update to version 6 because we were on 4 when we first plugged it in. And now we can actually do some of the configuration here if we really want to. This settings pane is basically broken out into 3 different areas. Overview, which is just kind of where you view the configuration. You can't change anything here. Insights, which is really just useful for seeing the channel usage. You can see this one is set to use automatic channel for 2.4 gig, and it selected channel 1, which is in parentheses. And then this little bar is just kind of the utilization of that channel. So if this bar is really high, or there's one color that is just completely imbalanced, then usually that indicates that that channel is too crowded. And that could indicate a problem. Now the controller should recognize that and automatically move to a new channel, but when you leave things up to technology, sometimes it just doesn't do it. But this channel looks fine. Our 5 gigahertz channel is on channel 46 and is only 2% utilized. The rest of this for the RF environment is only populated if you scan the channels, like do an actual RF scan, which takes the access point down for a little while. So we're not going to do that. And this third area is actual settings you can change. So the main one I'm concerned with is the name. I'm just going to name it Toasty's AP1. And what that's going to do is update the name it shows up as in the controller. So right now it just says UAP-AC-PRO. I'm going to change that to Toasty's AP1. And then we have these 2 settings, which is use the global AP settings and nightly channel optimization. I will show you in just a second where those are and what that's talking about. But the rest of this is your more advanced access point only configuration, and they're all grayed out because we're using the global AP settings. If we uncheck that, we can change the channel width, the transmit power, but not the channel for either of them because it optimizes the channel nightly. You have to disable that to change the channels manually. And then you also have more advanced configurations like band steering. You can tell the LED to be enabled or not. You can set static IP for your access point here by just selecting static IP and filling out all of these required boxes. I'm going to keep mine at DHCP though. Services, management VLAN if you need one. You will need to set that up under the network section, which I'll show you in a second. And SNMP information if you're going to be using that as well. Now the rest of this is just kind of management actions that you can take against the AP. So locate, that'll flash the LED. Restart, self-explanatory. Provision, this is just to force a settings push to the device. If for some reason you set a configuration and the access point didn't pick it up, you can force a provision and see if that'll work. You can download the information of it, or debug, which if we click on that, it basically just connects us to the actual access point's terminal. And that's for more advanced configurations, which we're not going to go into, so we'll go ahead and exit out of that. We also have the forget button. If we want to remove this device from this controller, then we can just hit forget and it'll kick it out. But we're not going to do any of that. Let's go ahead and put global AP settings and nightly channel optimization back to how they were. And at the bottom, I'm going to hit apply changes, which is just going to apply that name over here to our access point. Now the rest of the overview menus, the one that I'm usually concerned with the most is just WLAN, which is showing which networks are actually being broadcast by this access point. And you can see we have two of them, channel 44 and channel 1, which is our 2.4 and 5 gigahertz channels. The name is actually Toasty's new network, but it's cut off there. And the BSSID is just the MAC address of the access point. So those are the networks that it should have. And the rest of these menus are just like what access point group it's a part of if you configure one, the downlinks if you have a second device connected down the line, either I think wireless uplinks show here, or devices that are connected to the second Ethernet port on the access point. Air stats are just a bunch of statistics on the radios. Our uplink stats is our main Ethernet connection back to our switch or PoE Injector if you used one. General, just your general information. And then history, I'm not exactly sure what shows up here, maybe alerts or disconnects, but that's kind of just something that's only going to be there if the controller's always on and collecting whatever history that is. So let's go ahead and enter the actual settings menu, which is where all the configuration that applies to all these access points is done. So on the left here, the bottom cogwheel, settings, we get this nice menu. Now, one note on this menu is that this is actually a new user interface. If you're used to Ubiquiti equipment, this looks probably completely different than ones you've used in the past. I believe this interface came about either at the end of version 6 or the beginning of 7, but you can actually change this interface by going to System and clicking Enable on Legacy Interface. If I click that, I have the option to deactivate new user interface, and this will put me back to probably a more familiar interface if I'm used to dealing with Unifi equipment. So let's go ahead and exit out of that and go back to settings, and you can see our menu looks completely different. Now I did do another video that kind of, actually I think 2 videos that mention this, but I go into kind of the differences between different versions and these different menus and what's there, what isn't. But basically it's broken down into use the old interface if you are used to working on Unifi equipment already and you have a pretty good idea of where the settings that you want to change are, or if you want to have more access to some of the advanced features that might be a little more hidden in the new one. And if you're new to Unifi, or this is the first one you're setting up, or you just want to get it off the ground, just stick with the new interface. Because really, the newer interface is more streamlined. There's less obvious advanced settings, so it's a lot easier to get stuff just off the ground, while the older interface has a lot more options thrown at you at once that you may or may not necessarily need to change or worry about at all. So I just say if you're used to Unifi equipment in the older interfaces, switch to that, but if you're newer, use the newer interface. And to change it back in this version, we have to go to user interface here on the left and select new user interface under display, and then click apply changes, and that gets us back to the new interface. So going back to settings, this first page for Wi-Fi shows us our global AP settings. So while we were looking at the settings for our access point on the right, we had those two options for nightly channel optimization and use global AP settings. This is what it was talking about. So these are the settings that will apply to all access points that have that enabled. And these are pretty much all the same settings that we just saw in that per access point configuration menu. We have the channel width, the transmit power, as well as some AP site settings and the nightly channel optimization area. So instead of doing all of these configurations on every access point you deploy, you can set them here and it'll apply to all. So if we up these to 40 megahertz channel width and 80 megahertz for 5, switch the transmit power to low for both of these, then this will apply to all of our access points, at least all of them that have that feature enabled, which is enabled by default. And then here we can put in AP exclusions if we don't want these to apply to certain access points, which we only have one, so I want it to apply to that. These other settings we can enable or disable wireless meshing. If we disable that, we get this warning message that just says it'll prevent wireless device adoption. Are you sure you want to disable this? Typically I do not use wireless adoption unless there's no other way for me to get that AP connected, because as always, wired connections are better than wireless. So I'm going to use a wired connection if at all possible. But if I do have access points that's just not possible for me to get connected to the same network, I can wirelessly uplink them, but this will have to be enabled. And then we have new device auto link. I'm actually not sure what that is. Oh, that's for wireless cameras and IoT devices, and I actually never saw that configuration option before, but we're not going to worry about it. And then obviously if we want to disable channel optimization globally, we can do that here. I'm going to leave that enabled just because why not? And if we apply the changes, then our global AP settings have been updated, and that's going to push to all our devices. And if I go to devices here on the left, you can see our only AP has moved to a status of getting ready. So it's pushed those changes to it, and it is now applying them. And if we had more than one, they would all be going through these state changes as well. Now going back to the settings menu in Wi-Fi, we can edit our wireless network if we want, just by clicking on the name there at the top. We can change the SSID, we can update the password. This network would have a drop down if we'd configured more than one network, which I'll get to in a second. And then this is kind of our broadcasting APs, which access points we want to broadcast this network, which ones we don't. And you can see there's the AP group of all APs, which is only one. If we expand that, we have Toasties AP 1. And we have the option to create a new group if we want. Now where this is useful is if you have like multiple different buildings kind of in the same area and you want a wireless network that's like warehouse wireless or supply wireless, administration wireless, but say not all of those areas are in every building. You can break out and make groups for, say you've got 3 access points in the warehouse, 2 access points in administration, and like 4 for the supply area or something. You can make groups for each one of those areas, and then that way your wireless network will only apply to the ones you want it to apply to. But obviously that's for bigger deployments than just a house. Moving on down here, we have manual configuration enabled. Usually this is just automatic by default. We do get a warning if I switch it back to auto. So it says some of the changes applied may require reconnecting clients that are currently on the network. I'm not entirely sure which settings were changed, but it probably has something to do with the fact that I changed the radio settings and stuff like that. But if you do want to take manual control of the wireless network, you can do that here. I'm not going to go into these settings though, but I am going to go into how to add a second SSID if that is your thing, and also how to set up a VLAN network. So typically if you're setting these up, especially in a business environment, usually you have your internal wireless and your guest wireless. Usually your internal is just on the default regular network like we have this one set up, and your guest is usually on another VLAN. So to set up a new wireless network, first we need to create what's called a regular network, and that's under this tab. So here we already have default, and that has just a default subnet. Really, None of this information matters at all because we don't have a Unifi security gateway in our network or any other like Unifi router type device. So these settings are purely just for informational purposes unless we do have a Unifi gateway device. So we're going to add a new network and we're just going to call this one guest. And we have the option for a router, but that's not going to show up because we don't have a Unifi gateway device. And the rest of this is pretty much specific to if you have a gateway device as well. So I'm going to check this box that says VLAN only network, and then that narrows my options down to just setting a VLAN ID, which we'll say is VLAN 28 or whatever the guest network VLAN is you want it to be on. And then we can configure IGMP snooping and DHCP guarding, neither of which I'm going to worry about. So if we go ahead and add the network, now we have that one. It's called guest, VLAN only. And since we've set that network up, we can now apply it to a wireless network. So we need to create a new Wi-Fi network. We'll call that guest, give it a password 1234. And then here at the network dropdown, instead of it being on default, we're going to set guest. And that is what applies that VLAN tag to this wireless network. And then again, we have all the same options that I just went through. So let's go ahead and add the Wi-Fi network, and we also have the warning here that some of the changes applied will require reconnecting clients. Yeah, probably. We'll hit that. And I think the reason for that warning when adding this one is because the access point has to re-provision, and it's probably going to cut off access to Toasty's new network while it's adding our guest network SSID. But now that we've added that network and wireless network, if we go back to our device settings tab, we have Toasty's AP1. It is getting ready. Just going to go ahead and click on that, scroll down to the bottom WLAN section, drop that down, and you can see we now have two additional ones. We have the guest, which is on channel 36, and guest, which is on channel 5. So again, 2.4 gig and 5 gigahertz respectively there. This part here where it says channel 5, you probably don't really need to worry about this too much if this is a very small home deployment. However, this is what the auto configuration has done, is set us on channel 5 for 2.4 gigahertz. And if you know anything about wireless networking, you know that 1, 6, and 11 are really the only channels you should use. So why this selected 5 is a little bit beyond me, but that's a pretty good indicator of what the wireless channel is going to do. So we are now ready to go. If I head to my wireless selection on my phone, you can see I have guest and Toasty's new Wi-Fi. They're both showing up for me, as well as my other existing networks. Now, if I click on guest, I'm not going to be able to connect because I don't actually have the whole VLAN configuration for all my other devices set up for VLAN 28. If you are going to create a guest network using a VLAN, there is a lot more configuration on the back end of your other devices that has to happen. You can't just select, hey, this is going to be my guest network, I'm going to put it on VLAN 28 and expect it to work. There's a lot more into VLANs than just setting it on the access point. But I show you that configuration because if you are setting this up for a business and you're already familiar with VLANs, that's great information to know. So at this point, we've pretty much been good to go for a while now. We've just been going through the settings menu and making a few tweaks, showing you where all that's at. Now I'm just going to kind of hit through some of these different pages of the controller in case you're curious of what they are. If we go to the dashboard, instead of that advertisement and crap that we had earlier, we now have like most active access points, most active clients, which there's no active clients because I don't have anything connected. And then this will show the Wi-Fi experience for all of your connected clients. Basically all that is a percentage, 0 to 100, and it's mostly based on signal strength. So if you have a lot of clients that are very far away from your access points, or there's a lot of interference or something, your Wi-Fi score or Wi-Fi experience score is going to be lower. And that's just kind of a good gauge on if there's any issues or anything you need to look at even closer. Typically between like 85 and 100 is good. You don't need to look at anything. Usually it's between 90 and 100. It is never actually at 100, so just be aware of that. If we go down one menu, we have topology. Basically all this is just your different access points, and then off to the side it'll show all the active clients connected to them. It's really just a pretty menu. Devices we've already gone over. Client devices, this is where anything connected to your access points is going to show up. And I guess I'll go ahead and connect my phone to it just so we can have a client here. And there we go, there's my phone. It shows up as a client. So anything connected to them will show up here. But it'll show you the various statistics, the experience, which network they're connected to. This will show you all devices for all SSIDs on your access points. So if we had devices connected to guest, it would show that they're connected to guest. And if we go up here to display options, we can get a few more columns like the actual MAC address, the wireless band, whether that's 2.4 or 5, the channel that they're connected to. We can get different options here if we want them. And if we click on them, we get, again, a panel on the right with a lot more information. But moving on from that, if we go down to statistics, this is like a historical overview of the traffic. This bottom part, identified traffic for apps and clients, this is pretty much specific to a Unifi security gateway or Dream Machine. Your access points aren't going to classify that traffic. But here at the top, this should show you a historical view of how much data is being used. Again, if your controller's not running, it's not going to collect that data. So this is one of those that having an always-on controller is nice if you want to see this information, but it's not required. Moving down to Wi-Fi Insights, this actually used to give you a lot more information. I rarely use this menu at all anymore, but it shows an environment scan. This will show you all of the different SSIDs that are neighboring, their signal rate, so you can see it's showing Rugrats CIA and December Illini, which are both my other networks. It's showing that they have pretty good signal, but it's also showing some hidden networks as well as all these others, which are probably neighbors of mine and their signal levels, which are very weak. But other than that, I never use this tab. So moving on to system logs, this is just going to show you when either an administrator has logged into the console or if an access point has been disconnected, or just various events that are happening with the controller. You've also got threats and user activity. Those are specific to Unifi security gateways or Dream Machines. And then lastly, we have notifications, which is very similar to our system logs, but this is going to show you a lot more. So right now it says that we had an update. We updated this access point to 6.0.21. We adopted a device and a new device had been detected. So these two are very similar, but they'll show you a little bit different data. But anyways, that should be all you need to know to get these things off the ground and working. As always, if you have any questions, just leave them in the comments. And as always, happy networking.